Hi everyone, good afternoon, and thank you for joining us in our 2024 complimentary webinar series covering the FAR, or Federal Acquisition Regulations. We are coming to you live today from Washington, D.C., and we're glad you all could make it. Okay, so a bit about this series. As usual, all of our webinars are complimentary and recorded. The FAR has 52 total parts, and we will run through them sequentially each week on Wednesdays and Fridays at noon Eastern Time. The recordings and PowerPoints will be posted within 24 hours of the webinar's ending. You can find the recordings on our YouTube channel simply by subscribing to it using the link you see on the screen. There is no cost. You can find the PowerPoint on the SlideShare site using your LinkedIn credentials to log in. Again, it is free. We also offer sponsorship opportunities. If you are interested, please send us an email to hello@jenniferschaus.com. And now for how to sign up for the series. Unfortunately, there is no bulk registration and you must register individually for each webinar. If you go to the Jennifer Schaus website, navigate to the section called the FAR, and you'll find the individual registration links. Also, the recording links will be posted here upon the completion of each webinar. Please note that we covered the FAR in 2020, so if you are eager to get a jump start, please find these historical recordings on our site. Navigate to the Webinars tab and scroll down to the section The FAR 2020. Because it has been 4 years, many of the regulations have changed and been updated, so please use this as a reference tool only. And now a bit about us. We work with established federal contractors worldwide, helping them to navigate the market. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance. Some of the contract vehicles we support are listed here on your screen. For more information, please visit our website. Okay, those were our services for federal contractors, but we also provide marketing and advertising services for organizations who are selling to federal contractors. We can add the extra muscle to your marketing efforts via our newsletter ads and webinar sponsorship to in-person events. Please email us and ask for a media kit. We are currently offering a discounted offer in our newsletter, which reaches over 34,000 subscribers. If you want to place an order or have any questions, please send us an email to hello@jenniferschaus.com. As you know, congressional hearings on both the House of Representatives and on the Senate side are open to the public unless otherwise stated. We have a list here of the upcoming schedule, including the date, time, building, and room numbers. Most meetings take place in the Dirksen, Rayburn, or Cannon buildings. If you are selling to any of these departments or agencies, attending the hearings can be a great way to gather information, understand the process, and also network with influencers. Please join us for our Summer Shorts webinar series this August. We will be hosting 30-minute GovCon webinars with industry leaders. The series runs every day for 2 weeks, starting on Monday, August 12th, and ending on Friday, August 23rd. Webinars will begin at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, and as usual, they are free to join. Both the registration and the recording links can be found on our website under the tab Webinars. Here is the lineup for week 1. These leading ladies in the federal sector will cover various topics, including contract finance, contract management, capture, pricing, and compliance. In week 2, we will look at capability statements, BD, marketing, subcontracting, and M&A. Again, these webinars are complimentary and recorded. Please find the registration links on our website. Please join us for these upcoming complimentary webinars with various Apex accelerators. Jennifer will be covering GSA schedules as well as federal marketing for a local Apex accelerator in Virginia. These are complimentary and online. She will also be teaching 2 classes for the Maryland Apex Accelerator, one on marketing and one on GSA schedules in July and in December. And once again, these are complimentary. Our webinars are free thanks to our long time and our generous corporate and in-kind sponsors. Please allow me to introduce them. We would like to thank our friends at GovEvents, the premier platform for posting events related to government and government contracting. You can find all of our webinars and our events at govevents.com, as well as recordings from our past 600 plus webinars. We also want to thank Tom Johnson and his team at Set Aside Alert, the go-to publication for contracting opportunities for small, women-owned, veteran-owned, HubZone, and 8A firms. Visit Set Aside Alert for more information. The Fairfax Economic Development Authority has an online calendar of events and webinars. We want to thank them for posting our events and webinars on their calendar. The Virginia Apex Accelerator at George Mason University offers free one-on-one counseling to established government contracting firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. If you're interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore their services, review homework recommendations, register for live training, and find useful links to agencies and other self-directed learning. One-on-one counseling is limited to eligible client companies. Appointment requests are handled in the order they were received and based on counselor availability due to high demand. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. Join the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce's monthly GovCon Council meeting to network with peers, learn about upcoming events and opportunities, and help to shape future programming. The meetings take place the fourth Tuesday of each month at 8:30 a.m. at the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce. The next meeting will be on July 23rd. Do you want help winning government contracts? Bitsby can help. Users can find contract opportunities from federal, state, and local government. Additionally, you can search for teaming partners, incumbent point of contact, expiring contracts, compliance matrices, and also proposal templates. Create your login today at bitsby.com. Bitsby is an official partner of the U.S. Small Business Administration's E2G and Power to Grow program. Events are the ultimate engagement channel to bring government and industry together. 68% of government personnel that they attend more than one event each year. The Federal Business Council, or FBC, has worked with government and industry for 45 plus years to create gatherings where ideas are shared and to help government achieve its goals. This includes agency industry days, cybersecurity symposiums, technology expos, and offsite meetings. FBC provides full lifecycle meeting planning and event management. With over 5,000 meetings under their belt, FBC has the experience, systems, and personnel to make your next event exceptional. Learn more at fbcinc.com. Now, last but not least, please check out our friends over at GovBrew. GovBrew is the most read GovCon newsletter, keeping thousands of GovCon professionals in the loop with news, updates, and opportunities in the federal contracting market, all in a fun and accessible email that only takes 5 minutes to read. It's 100% free to join. It goes out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 a.m., and it's filled with great content, event postings, webinars, and more. We encourage you to sign up at govbrew.co, or you can use the QR code you see on the screen. And the reason we're here today is to cover FAR Part 47. Let's meet today's speaker. Please welcome Zach Jacobson to the webinar. Zach, we're so glad to have you with us today and are excited to hear your presentation. I'll put myself on mute and turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Zach Jacobson, and I'll be talking to you about FAR Part 47. I am an attorney at Seyfarth Shaw in our Washington, D.C. office, and I exclusively practice government contracts in our government contracts practice here in DC. Our firm is a full service government contracts firm. In my practice in particular, I tend to focus on government contracts related disputes, such as claims, claim appeals, bid protests, prime sub disputes, as well as general compliance counseling and other services. Transportation is an area that's near and dear to my heart because before going into the law firm world, I was an attorney in the government for a number of years, first as a judge advocate in the Army Corps of Engineers, and then later as a civilian attorney within the Department of the Army. And so as an advisor to contracting officers, I had the pleasure of navigating a lot of contract administration issues, many times related to transportation. And so I'm excited to talk to you about this topic here today. We do not have a Q&A portion here on this program. However, I encourage you to reach out to me in my email if you have any questions about anything we covered today. I'll be happy to get back to you with a response. Go to the next slide, please. All right, today's agenda. We're going to generally follow, as we're talking about FAR Part 47, so we're going to follow the structure of FAR Part 47. Today's topics are going to focus on the subpart by subpart, starting with definitions, concepts, and general policies that the government has regarding transportation. Once we get over that hurdle, we'll be able to jump right into the meat of things. We're going to start with contracts for transportation and related services, of course. And then we're going to go into what is where a lot of issues actually come up in my practice, at least, is transportation considerations and supply contracts. To the extent we have time remaining afterwards, policies and procedures related to air transportation, and of course, policies and procedures related to ocean transportation, because air and ocean transportation has a lot of unique rules and a lot of unique compliance matters that you need to focus on. Next slide, please. All right, so let's jump right into some definitions. These are some terms that are going to be coming up frequently, not only through this presentation, but if you have any contracts for supply that involves transportation, and most supply contracts do, or if you're in the transportation business, you're going to be seeing these a lot. But for everyone who maybe don't work in this area, it's important to make sure we have a common level of understanding what these different terms are, because they are used interchangeably throughout this part of the FAR. So first, we're going to talk about a bill of lading. Bill of lading is really your primary transportation document. This is essentially a receipt. It means that I, the carrier, have these goods that I picked up at this location, and I'm taking it to this destination, and I'm giving it to this person. And if there's any sort of special handling instructions or anything that goes along with that, it's all got to be right there. And there's different types of bill of lading. We'll talk about that a little later. But this is like a pretty critical document that if you're outside of shipping and logistics in your day-to-day business, you may not even have heard of this before. But it is very common for anyone that moves goods or services across the country or the world. We're going to be primarily talking about carriers. Carriers really in the FAR are divided up into two categories. And they're not necessarily mutually exclusive because it's going to be based on the type of relationship that the government has with the carrier. So first you have your common carriers. Common carriers are who we as individual consumers, as well as businesses that perhaps engage in commerce, these are the types of, this is what we think of when we think of a carrier. We're thinking of FedEx, we're thinking of UPS. These are just sort of businesses that are providing general transportation services to the public. And the reason, and they're doing it all the time. So if I live in Washington, DC, not far from me, there's a large FedEx facility. No matter who you are in the public, if you show up and you pay the rate and you follow their instructions, they will take a package from you and they will deliver it to wherever it needs to go. And it will travel by truck, by plane, you name it. And they make it happen, and then they do it. But you have to understand that common carriers are highly regulated, and there's a lot of rules that apply to them, particularly when it comes to rates. And so that's going to be very important for the government when they're deciding what means of transportation they're going to use for moving their goods. Then you have contract carriers, and all contract carrier means is this is a carrier that provides transportation services to their clients. And this is going to be done through a contractual arrangement. And the government does this as well, but you need to understand that a contract carrier is not necessarily a different company from a common carrier. It's all going to be based on what is going to be the type of relationship. Is the government moving a good? The way I like to think about it from my own experience is a common carrier is like getting on the bus, right? It has a bus route and it's going to go from point A to point B with stops in between, and you can get on and get off however, based on wherever you need to go. And that's your common carrier. A contract carrier is like Uber. You pull up the app and you hire somebody, and subject to those terms, they're going to move you to where you need to go. Uber is more expensive than the bus for the consumer, and that's because the bus is regulated. The bus is regulated and it's serving the general public, while Uber is serving you in that particular instance. And so that's how I like to think about that with transportation. We're also talking about government rate tenders. We're going to go into this a little more later, but it's just something to understand that common carriers have a lot of regulations, including the pricing. Government rate tender is in effect, it's a discount. It's an authority to offer a better rate to the government than you may have to offer to the general public. And we can talk about that a little more later. Next slide, please. So those are the sort of terms that are going to be in and out, and we're going to be adding more terms as we go. But let's talk about the applicability of FAR Part 47. FAR Part 47 is a little elusive when you think about it, because unlike other parts of the FAR, it's not exclusive to contracts for transportation. It's really more nebulous than that. It applies to the government's transportation considerations generally, which can include procurement of supplies, because unless you're making the supplies that the government's buying at the government facility and handing it to the government there, it's going to go from point A to point B. It's going to leave a warehouse facility and go to another warehouse facility, or it's going to go to an inspection site, it's going to go to a job site, things like that. And so that's going to have a ton of transportation considerations. Now acquiring transportation services is what you would expect when you traditionally go through different FAR parts that are looking at different types of contracts. There is a little bit of that there, because transportation services are, although typically, as we'll talk about, handled at the much larger level by DoD or GSA through multiple award types, ordering agreements. But there's a lot of things that go into that have to be considered by the contracting officer and by the team when they're going to award one of these transportation services contracts that we'll talk about, of course, here. And then finally, what you want to keep in mind is, these rules are really important because the government is concerned about two things. Number one, they're concerned about successful delivery. I mean, they want to make sure that the supplies that they need gets to where it needs to be on time. But the second thing, and this is going to loom large in a lot of these rules, is the government is interested in controlling transportation costs. And so everything is going to be determined based on what costs are the government willing to bear for this particular transaction, and what costs is the government not willing to bear. And it's going to be pushed back onto the carrier. And so a lot of the terms that we're going to see in these different contracts are going to be based on the allocation of responsibility for shipment, the who has to ensure what, and who is responsible for the goods at what point in time in the goods transportation from the origin to the destination. Next slide, please. So general policies. There's a lot of general policies in this part of the farm. We just don't have time to go through all of them. But these are the three most basic things that I think we really need to remember. First of all, for domestic and international shipments, the government approaches very differently. For domestic shipments, typically contracting officers are going to use commercial bills of lading, and if they can, on common carriers. And that's just because we have a robust logistics and supply chain inside the United States. There's multiple companies, there's lots of companies, and it's closely regulated by the Surface Transportation Board. So there's a lot of opportunities for cost savings to the government, and they don't have to sacrifice efficiency and safety of the shipment by using these commercial bills of lading. And remember, we talked about what a bill of lading is in the beginning. It's basically your receipt, right, for the transportation service. We're going to talk about commercial and government bills of lading, but this is only important. I bring that up now because it's important to understand that there's government bills of lading and commercial bills of lading when we're talking about international or non-contiguous, meaning to Alaska or Hawaii or to one of our territories, domestic shipments. So when you're going through an international shipment, typically what the government is going to do is they're going to prepare the government bill of lading, and they're going to have this agreement directly negotiated with the carrier. This is different than what you would typically see with a commercial shipper, who's going to be the one preparing the commercial bill of lading when they receive the goods. So it's just important to sort of draw this distinction here, because what document you're looking at is actually going to be pretty critical, because it also shows who's taking responsibility. If the government's issuing the government bill of lading versus a commercial shipper shipping a commercial bill of lading, it kind of indicates who's taking responsibility for what, and it's something to always pay attention to. Now, finally, the government does own or in fact lease or charter various aircraft or vessels all the time. And sometimes the government will use its own assets for transportation, but across the board, the preference for the government is to use commercial carriers. The government does not want to get into the logistics business. The government wants to use the market for these services. It believes that there are more cost savings there. However, sometimes the government will use its own assets, and typically the calculus goes along the lines of assets are available, assets will result in savings, and the use of assets is going to comply with whatever applicable laws and policies apply. The fact of the matter is, especially domestically within the United States, it's just often not very cost effective for the government to move its own stuff. Next slide, please. So let's talk about some more general policies here. One of them is transportation insurance. Unlike what you will see in the private sector, the government is just not going to buy insurance coverage for its property that's in the possession of common carriers. The common carriers, again, like I said at the outset, in the United States, our common carriers are it's a highly regulated industry. And so there's certain standards of care, higher standard of care actually than what you would expect in other types of commercial transaction, dealing with ensuring the safety and security of your cargo. And so the government essentially, and this is again the control costs, I'm sure, saw that standard of care and said, well, that's good enough for us. So if a loss happens that's above and beyond what you're responsible for, we'll pick up the tab. There's no need to buy additional insurance. Now, that being said, the government takes cost control with transportation very seriously. And depending on how the contract is structured, be it a firm fixed price or cost reimbursement, you're going to have different responsibilities as the contractor in terms of payment and audit requirements. And there's going to be different procedures or regulations that apply based on whether you're dealing with the Department of Defense or if you're dealing with a civilian federal agency. Next slide, please. Here are government rate tenders again. And again, it's an authorization to offer transport to persons or cargoes for the government, either without charge or at a reduced rate. And so how does this work? Well, typically, the government rate tenders will apply to either government bills of lading or commercial bills of lading, where you're going to have transportation charges that are assignable to the government. And that's kind of critical here, that the government's paying for transportation. If the contractor is responsible for transportation, then this is not going to be, unless the government is paying the contractor for it, this is not really going to apply. Agencies, of course, can also negotiate directly with the carriers to do additional or revised rates. And you'll see in there's a note here, the contract clause, you're going to see a notation on a commercial bill of lading indicating whether or not a government rate tender applies. Now, we've talked a lot, I've sort of laid out kind of what the government's looking at here in terms of cost savings, and how a lot of it is going to depend on where the government assumes responsibility for the supplies. Is it when it leaves the contractor's facility? Is it when it leaves the carrier's truck and ends up in the government's facility? And that's what we're going to talk about. You're going to see a lot of those later when we go into actual contract clauses. But we're going to see a lot of clauses that deal with what are called FOB destination or FOB origin. FOB, of course, stands for free on board. It is a term used in shipping to indicate when the responsibility and liability for goods are transferred from the seller to the buyer, or from the contractor to the government. And so the specific point at which this transfer occurs depends on what's in the contract, right? And it depends on the type of the type of contract, where you're going. There's lots of factors that go into it, and we don't even have time to go through all the different types of terms that can be used. But typically, they're going to be variations of FOB origin or FOB destination. And for fixed price contracts in particular, if it's FOB destination, which means the responsibility and liability for the goods are going to pass from the contractor to the government when the goods reach the government specified location, i.e. the destination, you're not going to use government rate tenders because that's the contractor's responsibility. The contractor's out there assuming responsibility with the carrier. That's not, the government's not a party to that. Now, if it's going to be FOB origin, that's different, because at FOB origin, the government is assuming responsibility and liability for the goods from the contractor when it's shipped. So when the carrier shows up, or when the contractor drops off the stuff with the carrier, the government is assuming responsibility. In that case, the government's going to want to receive the benefit of the government rate tenders, and so that's what would be authorized if deemed advantageous to the government. And what would happen in that case, because it is a contractor, the contractor will still use the commercial bill of lading, but it will note the government rate tenders are in play, and the government, of course, will pay. All of this is going to be established in the contract. Cost reimbursement contracts, of course, the government doesn't really care because they're going to reimburse the contractor anyway. And so government rate tenders apply, government reimburses at full cost. Next slide, please. Okay, so those are sort of the general concepts and terms and conditions and definitions, and we're going to be revisiting them as we go forward. So let's go into the next part, which is transportation contracts. So what are we talking about when we say transportation contract? Typically, we're going to be talking about freight transportation, which includes, local transportation, of course. It could be rail, it could be motor, it could be domestic water, it could be freight forwarders. We're also talking about transportation related services. And this is really important from the government's perspective when you're trying to consider how can we give enough information to the contractor to get accurate bids. Because it's, transportation, if you look at it very narrowly, transportation only concerns movement of the freight from point A to point B. So what about loading the freight? What about packaging the freight? What about marking the freight? When you're loading, are there special safety precautions you have to take if you're using, say, like a long haul trailer? Or what if you're doing it at a dock or at a terminal? How are you supposed to load the shipment onto the ship? I mean, there's all these different things that happen that are basically services. And those related services, are going to be subject to perhaps the Service Contract Act. And there may be additional considerations in terms of dealing with collective bargaining agreements or other regulations that will come into play and could affect the cost. Now, when we're talking about transportation contracts under this part of the FAR, it's important to note that we're not talking about common carriers. That is not a transportation contract. That is a common carrier, meaning we're acquiring the transportation through a bill of lading. Most commonly in the government, it's moving military service members' household goods. It's also important to note that this subpart is not going to apply to contracts below the simplified acquisition threshold. Next slide, please. So what are we moving, right? Well, the FAR is kind of funny, right? They basically divide it into two different categories. You have your general freight, which is just transportable property other than household goods, or office furniture. Office furniture is, it's furniture, equipment, fixtures, records, equipment and materials used in, it says offices or hospitals. And so it's really interesting. And so when you think about it, the reason that they do this is not, yes, there might be special handling requirements with interior fixtures versus things that are in a crate. But really it's because you may be moving from office to office within a city or across cities, or you may be moving from office to hospital. And so you're going to have unique handling and loading and unloading requirements, as well as unique considerations within the transportation versus what you typically think about, which is a container unit or a crate or something on a pallet that's just sort of picked up and thrown in with a bunch of other stuff. And so I think that's why they do the distinction here. Now, it's interesting because the FAR generally sets up these requirements as if you're out there awarding a contract. But really, single movement contracts are not the most common way that the government moves things under transportation contracts. It's appropriate if you have like a unique transportation need that's not really available in any other way. But but that's very expensive. And so typically what will happen is the GSA or the DOD is going to award basically a basic ordering agreement. You're going to have a bunch of different carriers. So most
Zach, sorry to interrupt, but putting out of
pre-solicitation touched on these already. Again, we have transportation related service. That means those services may be subject to the Contract Act or the Service Contract Labor Standards Act. Now, when you're thinking about transportation services, you may requirements. You may still have minimum wage requirements. There's a lot of things coming. You also have to think about government acceptance, right? Government orders, they will not accept prior. Can you hear me? Oh.
I think you're just.
Am I on?
Yes. Okay. Back on.
How about now?
All set.
Okay. Well, let's see what's going on here. Is this better?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Sorry about that. Well, as you can see on the slide, there are a lot of considerations you have to think about in terms of qualification of contractors and special requirements regarding rates, insurance, and shipping. Next slide, please. So qualification of offerers, like I've said, this is a highly regulated industry. And so contractors need to ensure that they have enough information to accurately bid, or to, of course, accurately bid, or to ensure that they're qualified to perform. Contracts are out there, and the contracting officers can go a long way to help contractors understand that by ensuring that one, they're looking at offers that are actually authorized to do the job. This is a regulated industry. Interstate transportation, of course, requires certain permits and authorities. And of course, performance capability. There's certain laws and regulations that apply to carriers, and they have to be capable of complying. And this includes perhaps familiarization with conditions or financial statements. And so in order to see that the government is dealing with contractors who are financially capable, legally authorized to work, they also have to make sure that they're giving them enough information to ensure that they're able to comply. That means they need to know the destination and the pickup location. They need to know the conditions. And so the more information that the government can provide, the more accurate a bid they're going to receive from a transportation contractor. Next slide, please. And so what kind of terms are you going to see in transportation contracts? This is pretty basic, but there's a reason why the FAR talks about this. And I think it's because there were contracts that were missing this basic information. You need to know when the goods need to be delivered, or if it's a multiple order situation, you need to know what your term is, when you need to be available to make delivery. You need to know what you're moving. You need to know where it's going, and you also need to know if it's depending on the type of freight that you're moving, you need to know what method is going to be used to determine weight, because depending on how heavy it is and how you're moving it, that's going to determine your compliance costs of moving it across states. Rates and charges, of course. You need very specific basis of pricing, and all of that needs to be provided in the contract in advance. Both parties need to understand liability and insurance, because again, depending on who receives responsibility at what point in the transportation process, that's going to determine a lot when it comes to the contractor's pricing, frankly, because the longer the contractor's responsibility for the goods, the more expensive it's going to be for the contractor, and therefore the higher the price. And then finally, there's going to be shipping and billing document requirements, and this is especially critical if you're doing military shipments, or if you're using military receiving facilities. A lot of those facilities require receiving certain reports in advance before they'll receive you at the facility. And so knowing and understanding these documentation requirements, who these points of contacts are throughout your performance, and then of course ensuring that these basic terms have been negotiated and are in the contract up front will ensure a successful contract performance. Next slide, please. So again, there's going to be some other key clauses, and I included them here for you, but the key is, number one, it's got to be in writing. It's got to be in writing. I'll say it again, it's got to be in writing. Do not rely on oral agreements, because as you can see here, the government has inserted a clause that ensures that oral agreements will not affect the contract. Direction of marking is very important, and you need to make sure that, if that clause is in there, that you're complying with it. Government furnished equipment, all you really need to know from a transportation perspective is there's going to be a clause that governs that, and it should include if you have operators or without operators. And as I mentioned before, a lot of times there's going to be advanced notification requirements on the contractor. Well, there'll also be on the government. There'll also be advanced notification requirements that the government has to meet, because they're responsible for giving the contractor enough advance notice for ensuring delivery at specific times or for unusual shipments. Next slide, please. So here's some other things you need to think about. The contract should be covering, the type of equipment. What equipment does a contractor have to provide to move this material or to move these personnel? And is it material that equipment that the contractor has to furnish? It's also going to talk about, labor. What labor is the contractor supposed to furnish? What materials does the contractor have to furnish? Because all of that, again, is going to be baked into the price. Because sometimes you arrive at a delivery location and there's already people there ready to unload. But maybe you have to do that yourself as the transportation contractor. All of that needs to be spelled out in the contract. There's, loading and unloading, and we talked about that. And then return of undelivered freight. What do you do if delivery is unsuccessful? Who has responsibility for returning it? That needs to be spelled out. And of course, receipt of shipment. Again, all of these clauses are in the FAR. It's important that you note them, and if you're in your contract, they spell out pretty clearly what your responsibilities are going to be for each of these considerations. Next slide, please. So that's transportation contracts in a nutshell. But moving on to supply contracts, this is where there can be a lot of complexity because again, in supply contracts, unlike transportation contracts, the focus of supply contracts that involve transportation is to minimize costs, because transportation is just another cost to the government. And so what the FAR is going to direct the requiring activity to do is to actually think about this when they're planning their requirements, and they want to position supplies, and they ultimately want to distribute them. And so the contracting officer should be working with both the requiring activity and the contracting officer's transportation office before they make any acquisition of supplies, especially if they're supplies that are unusual, if they're large, they're heavy, they're dangerous, or they require a lot of containerized movements, because it's going to result in additional costs. And sometimes the contracting officer in the requiring activity is not going to have the bigger picture that the transportation office is going to have of shipment traffic considerations and other contract vehicles that may already exist that might be able to absorb some of the material transportation needs. Next slide, please. Defense transportation system. This is another thing. Again, if you're working with the Department of Defense, you really need to have this regulation on your computer, because contracting activities are required to enforce the requirements contained in the DTR Part 2 and incorporate them into all their appropriate contracts. And so that means that that's because agencies that are shipping or arranging the acquisition and shipment by contractors using any military controlled transport or through any military facilities are going to be subject to a lot of unique rules and regulations. As like the one I mentioned earlier is, they will not receive your shipment if you did not notify them in advance and give them the appropriate paperwork. And so it's really important that contracting activities set their contractors up for success by including all the requirements as appropriate, and the contractors are prepared to comply. You're going to have a contract document, then your contract documents, you're going to have a contract administration office designated. And that's going to be that's going to be your point of contact, and hopefully your only receiving point for all of the different types of information that's required in order to comply with the Defense Transportation Regulation. So we're talking about like shipment clearances, marking and freighting routing that's going to be unique to the Department of Defense. And so you just need to be cognizant that these requirements are going to be out there so you can avoid any unintended consequences that could delay delivery of shipment. Next slide, please. So here we go. We're back to FOB, right? FOB origin. And that means free expense of the government delivered, and it goes, again, on the board indicating the type of conveyance of the carrier or of the government at the designated point from which a shipment will be made, usually the contractor's facility, and from which transportation service, as opposed to just local or terminal, and where it will begin. And it also can cover if it's placed on the carrier's wharf, if it's ship side, the carrier's freight station. It could also mean to the U.S. Postal Service facility, or really to any government designated point within the same city or commercial zone as a FOB origin point specified in the contract. So that means that the government is not on the hook for any expenses until it gets to one of these places. And so once it arrives at one of these places, then the government's on the hook. Now, the contract, again, is going to specify what this means. And remember, thinking back, it's either FOB origin or FOB destination generally. And these different scenarios that are here on this slide kind of teases at what we're going to talk about with the different types of variations on the next few slides. Next slide, please. So another variation of this is FOB origin contractor responsibilities. And so you're going to see, and again, there's a contract clause for that, as there is for all these things. So if you have a FOB origin shipment, these are the types of things that the contractor has to do. And remember, the contractor has to use both the, comply with the contract, but also use the appropriate bill of lading, and it has to have the material that's here on this slide. And again, all of this is going to be spelled out in your FAR contract clause. But these are the types of things that that could be really critical. These are the types of things that could be make or break whether or not the government is going to accept shipment. If any of these are not complied with, you could have an issue. Next slide, please. Now, here's some other variances of that. FOB origin at the contractor's facility. FOB origin freight allowed, meaning there's an allowance of freight, or this is where you're talking about like government rate tenders between the points that'll be deducted from the contract price. Maybe you're doing FOB origin freight prepaid, where all the costs of the government is assuming the cost of all transportation, but the contractor has to prepay it. And again, remember, if this is in your contract, you're going to have unique audit requirements you have to comply with. You also have the FOB origin with differentials, meaning you're going to have different modes of transportation for different places of delivery, and all of this is going to be added into the price. And all of these different variations, again, should be captured in the contract under the appropriate FAR clause. Next slide, please. Now, that was FOB origin. So now we're back to FOB destination. This is, again, FOB destination is when the government receives responsibility at delivery. So we're talking about free expense of the government delivered on board the carrier's conveyance at a specified delivery point at the consignee's facility, meaning the person who's receiving it, and then all of these different things. Supplies have to be sent to the designated location. The government is not liable for delivery before actual delivery, meaning if you have stopping points along the way, the government is not responsible for anything that happens. If it's by rail carrier, you're going to have a specified unloading platform. If it's for motor carrier, delivered to the truck tailgate at the unloading platform. And then there's different levels of responsibility based on what type of freight. And then, of course, for rate carriers and freight forwarders, you have the contractor has a responsibility to ensure that the carrier is going to furnish tailgate delivery where required, or if transfer to truck is required to complete delivery. And so this is a level of detail that you don't always see in government contracts, because at FOB destination, the government is not only telling you, what type of transportation is involved, they're telling you the exact place of delivery that must happen and the exact conditions that must be met for the government to assume responsibility or liability, that is, for the goods that have been shipped. Next slide, please. And so the responsibilities of the contractor are going to be a little different, but not different in type, but not really the different type of things. The key thing to write is that before you get to the specified point of delivery, the contractor, unless otherwise stated in the contract, is going to be responsible for all the costs and is going to be liable for any loss or damage occurring before receipt of shipment at the point that indicated in the contract. And the contractor is going to be solely responsible for preparing and distributing the bills of lading, for marking the shipments, all of those types of things. Another variation that's common here is FOB destination within a consignee's premises. That's like, if you get down to this is the level of detail that you may be subject to here, where you have to not only take it to a certain premises, but you have to lay it down inside the doors in a specific room, perhaps in a specific manner, before the government will assume responsibility. And so these terms are pretty important, because if you put it in the wrong room or you leave it outside, the government has not been delivered the good, and you're on the hook for any resulting damages or loss that may occur just because it didn't go to the right place. Next slide, please. So as you can see, there's a lot of other types of delivery terms, but you'll see that these are really variations of the same concept. It's FOB destination when it's at a vessel, or when it's at a point of shipment, or when you're at an inland carrier, or when it has to go to a certain dock or a certain pier or a certain warehouse, when it has to go to a terminal for an air carrier, or it has to, you know, if that air carrier terminal is it an export terminal or an import terminal. Or for certain destinations, you're going to have a lot of different varieties. And all those varieties mean is that at some point, the government has to take responsibility.
Zach, I think you're breaking up again.
Then there are a lot of conditions under which they want to take this. They want a contract, but I know conditions your eyes can roll back. It's a lot. Any of these are in there. Any of these are 52.247 are in there. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay, great. Let's go to the next slide, please. Just a quick note before moving on that there's, you know, small package shipments. The government's not unreasonable. They certainly authorize you to ship supplies by common carriers on your commercial bill of ladings if they're small packages or by commercial air. And if you're this is part of a larger shipment that you're doing, the government will pay, and the government's paying for this shipment cost. You know, they'll do a pro rata share of your entire freight shipment, which can be very helpful. It's a way, you know, you can, as a contractor, utilize economies of scale by just consolidating your shipments, and then the government will cover its portion. You just have to ensure that your invoicing shows the line item, and it all makes a lot of sense. And of course, if it's less than $250, the government may just waive it altogether. And there at the bottom, I included the prepaid freight small package shipments FAR clause for your reference. Next slide, please. So, you know, what FOB term is going to be in your contract, right? And the FAR is pretty prescriptive in what the contracting officer is supposed to consider when deciding if something should be a FOB origin or FOB destination. And so, as a general matter, FOB origin is going to be preferable to the government. It's usually cheaper because there's a lot less is being asked of the carrier, and it's a lot simpler to administer because it means the contractor is really just responsible up until it ships. And then after that, it's between the carrier and the government what happens. This is also, if the government doesn't have enough information at the time it has its requirement to give a precise destination, it makes FOB destination kind of unworkable. Now, FOB destination will be very appropriate in certain situations. Specifically, and most commonly, if the government has to accept supplies at the destination, especially if they're going to be doing an inspection or something like that. If it's going, you know, there's also certain types of products that this is actually preparing for this presentation, I wasn't even aware of. So if you're shipping forest products or perishable supplies that could be under in-transit deterioration, the government's totally required to do FOB destination, but that makes sense because this has very unique and time-sensitive handling requirements and probably unique storage requirements as well. So the final thing to think about with transportation and which FOB origin or destination category you really should be in is that, you know, CONUS shipments, again, within the continental United States, you've got a robust supply chain and a robust logistics network. And so typically lowest cost to the government is going to be what they should be going with, and that's what's reasonable. But OCONUS is going to be different because there's a lot of other considerations that are involved. Next slide, please. These are some other key factors that the government is supposed to use. And really, it's all, these are different ways of coming back to economies of scale. Transit arrangement, mode of transportation, consolidation of shipments, quality analysis. This is just talking about, you know, they don't want to be inefficient. They don't want to have cross hauling and back hauling where the shippers are going back and forth in order to put individual things in certain locations. You could consolidate everything together. You could stop things off. There's ways the government is trying to manage this not as a one-to-one, but more as a network of traffic, that they're trying to make sure that goods are moving in a way that's efficient, but it's also cost effective as well. Next slide, please. Now, what factors are the government going to be looking at when they're evaluating your proposal for a supply contract that has a transportation component? Well, costs and shipping and receiving facilities are really the only two major factors that come into play. And costs, especially if you're CONUS, are probably going to be the primary factor, because the contracting officer is supposed to use the lowest available freight rates and related charges. Now, this is something that's pretty interesting you should keep an eye on, is that, you know, there's a cutoff for this, and it has to be the date of initial shipment as of either bid opening for sealed bidding or offer submission deadline for negotiated procurement. So if the rates change after the proposal or the bid have been submitted and open, the contracting officer just can't use the new ones in evaluating your proposal, unless, of course, no such rates existed. I haven't personally seen this as a basis for protest, but it would be something that I'd be interested to see should the government get this wrong. Now, transportation cost determinations, these are the list of things that the FAR provides that the government is supposed to consider when they're looking at your transportation costs. They also are supposed to look at, in addition to cost, the type and adequacy of the shipping facilities, including the ability to work efficiently through ways like consolidating shipments, and the same of whatever the consignee's receiving facilities will. Because basically what the government is worried about here is, you know, shipping schedules that are just too inefficient or too complicated to really work. And they want to make sure that the facilities are capable of handling the volume and the types of goods that'll be shipped through. Next slide, please. Air transportation. We're gonna go through this pretty quickly because there's not a lot here, but there's a lot of things that are unique to air transportation, particularly the Fly America Act, Federal Aviation Act, that applies to air transportation considerations. But typically US, the term you need to remember for this part is, you know, US flag air carrier is the air carrier holding a certain certificate designated as such. But typically what we're looking at here is that we need to use, the government is going to want the use of US flag air carriers for any US government financed international air transportation if it's available. And what the FAR provides is an awfully long, complex series of analyses that the government has to perform in order to determine whether or not a US flag air carrier service is available in order to ensure its compliance with the Fly America Act. And I also include a Comptroller General report that's a handy guideline to give you sort of an introduction to this concept. Next slide, please. And so you can see that there's going to be a lot of if-thens, right? So the easiest one is if a US flag air carrier just simply can't do it, or it would not accomplish the mission, then it's okay to use a foreign flag air carrier. But there's a lot of scenarios where they say this sounds difficult, where basically the FAR is saying this sounds difficult, but the air flag carrier is still available. And as you can see here on this slide, there's a few of them. If we go to the next slide, I think there's some more. Yeah. And so it's all about interchange points, about, you know, where is the destination, where is the traveler, or where are the goods changing planes, where is the origin, is any of it domestic, what are the, I mean, there's a lot of and even wait times. I think if you go to the next slide, there might have one about wait times. Yeah, it's just, it's bananas, I think. This is crazy, but what they're trying to do here is ensure compliance with Fly America. It's so you have these very prescriptive analyses that are going to be going on, scrutinizing the transportation of personnel or transportation of material by air, ensuring that if a US flag carrier is available, it will be used in order to ensure compliance with the Act. And that's why it sets up all of these if-then scenarios throughout the FAR. And of course, you have the clause there at the bottom of this slide of the US flag air carriers. So, I mean, for example, you know, right here, travel by foreign flag, if it eliminates 2 or more aircraft changes, then okay, a US flag carrier is not available. Like, so you have to analyze the flight path to determine how many aircraft changes are involved to determine whether or not a US flag air carrier is available. And of course, that's outside of the US only. If it goes in and out of, if the flight is going to go a gateway airport in and out of the US, then it changes everything. And you have to look at travel status. How long is the individual going to be waiting? 6 hours seems to be the cutoff. Or for short distance travel, it's now 3 hours. And remember, most of the rules seem designated toward personnel, but it applies to personnel and air freight forwarders. Next slide, please. Now, ocean transportation is similar to air transportation in the sense that the government is supposed to be giving preference by law to US flag vessels that are registered in and operating the jurisdiction of the United States. And there's a number of laws here on this slide for your reference, but basically what this is where that comes from, where that preference comes from. It's required by law, and so the government is going to adopt a lot of rules to ensure that they're in compliance. Next slide, please. So again, of course, there's a FAR clause for that. However, there are going to be exceptions to the rule. And typically it's going to be exceptions for transportation between foreign countries using foreign currencies. There's going to be exceptions for shipments of classified supplies when the classification prohibits the use, in any case, of non-government vessels. And then also there's some flexibility when you're dealing with commercial products in your subcontracts. But there's an exception to the exception. As you can see, there's a lot of things there. But generally, when we're talking about ocean transportation, we're out of the coastal or inland waters of the United States. We're crossing the ocean. If there are supplies that are owned by the government or by the contractor, or they're in the possession of the government or the contractor, even if they're being distributed overseas for foreign assistance, if they've been acquired by U.S. currency, you have to use a U.S. flag commercial vessel. There is a 50% requirement in terms of 50% of it in the Cargo Preference Act. If you look at the rules, it's a little strange, but essentially what they're saying is that is not even going to get in the way of using a privately owned U.S. flag or commercial vessel. Next slide, please. So we're right at time. Thank you so much for attending and your attention today. Like I said, I'm Zach Jacobson from Site-Barth Shaw, and my email is there in the slides. If you have any questions about what we talked about today, I'm more than happy to respond. Thank you again for your attention, and thank you, Emma, for your help.
Thank you to you, Zach, for an informative presentation, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. As mentioned, you can always catch the recording on our YouTube channel within 24 hours, and you'll find over 600 webinars on government contracting there. That's it for today. Thank you, everyone.